It was written by Charles Wesley, the somewhat lesser-known brother of John Wesley, founder of the Methodist movement, one of thousands of hymns that he wrote in his lifetime. Christ the Lord is risen today. Come, thou long-expected Jesus, love divine, all loves excelling. And yet, when he wrote this particular tune, it had a different title. Hark, how all the welkin ring. Doesn't exactly flow trippingly off the tongue. Hark, how all the welkin rings. Now, for those who are unfamiliar with the term welkin, it means sky or heavens. You're welcome. Hark, how all the welkin rings. It tells the story of the glory that shone on the day that Jesus was born. The glory of all the sky and heavens abound. It became so popular with Charles Wesley's church that they sang it every Christmas, and he began to share it with his friends around him, to share with other churches. One of his friends was a college buddy, George Whitefield, and as sometimes happens with college buddies, he took some liberties. You see, though they met at Oxford, George Whitefield, that famous evangelist, was a bartender turned preacher, and he never let biblical accuracy stand in the way of a good turn of verse. And so he changed hark how all the welkin rings to hark the herald angels sing. And it stuck. And from that moment on, Charles Wesley never sang it again. Because, as he would remind us, the angels do not sing in the story. Believe it or not, friends, there was a time when church people were picky about music. Christmas music in particular. I know it's hard to believe as we've advanced so far, but you'll have to take my word for it on this one. People were persnickety about which songs, about when songs could be sung, about where songs could be sung, and most importantly, what songs could be sung, preferring those old chestnuts to those newfangled melodies that no one understands. Who wants a hippopotamus for Christmas anyway? And yet, when that spark happened, let's call it the Holy Spirit, when musician and lyricist came together to find something new, they were able to share something with us that set the spirit of the season in motion. We take it for granted often as part of the decoration of Christmas. But if we're honest, it's the music that gets us in the spirit. Whether we're some that draw that hard line, no Christmas music until the day after Thanksgiving, the way God intended, or whether we start listening shortly after the 4th of July, either way, it is Christmas music that gets us in the spirit. And behind every song is a story. A person or persons who pulled that tune together to try and tell us something about this season. And so today, on this second Sunday of Advent, as we continue in our annual Hidden Figure series, where we tell a different story every month, today we tell a few stories behind some of those favored carols, those carols which are designed to remind us in voice and song of for whom the bells toll, or if you like, why the welkin rings. Born in 1771, James Montgomery was born to Irish missionary Moravian parents. Try saying that 3 times fast. And when he was only 5 years old, his parents felt a call to go to the West Indies, and so they left him with the Moravian community to care for him, who transferred him around between schools and schools until he eventually landed at age 7 in Yorkshire, England, at a seminary there. He was at that seminary, having not seen his parents for 7 years, when he learned at 12 years old of their sudden death. He dropped out of school and began to wander the streets for the next decade. Poor and mostly homeless, he would work odd jobs here and there and spend whatever extra money he had on pencils. You see, he learned that he loved to write. And being an Irishman in England at the time, he had much to write about. He recognized the treatment he experienced at the hands of the British, and so he began to pen editorials that he would take to papers and try to get them to publish them, but they turned out they were way too radical for any paper to publish, save for one, the Sheffield Register, who took a chance on him when he was 23 and began to publish his articles. The articles began to sell a lot of papers. People would come to them trying to recruit others to the Irish cause of independence, and they would constantly look for his article. But it also drew the attention of the government, who quickly moved that editor out of town, leaving a position open that James Montgomery was happy to fill. Twice imprisoned for his beliefs, he continued to write, becoming more and more adamant about those issues of social justice, particularly poverty and slavery, speaking out against them. All the while he was penning these editorials, he kept going back to the scriptures, trying to understand the faith that had so motivated his parents, whom he had barely known. And so he would write these editorials calling for justice and read the scriptures trying to make sense of his faith, until one day he finally came to the understanding that it takes too many Christians too long to figure out that the call of justice and the call of Christ are one in the same. Which was how, on Christmas Eve, 1816, those faithful readers grabbed that Sheffield Iris, now renamed at the time, and discovered, though they thought they would get a call to arms, a prayer for peace, a simple, beautiful poem that told of angels from the realms of glory watching o'er the shepherds when the Christ child was born. A poem that would go on to share the good news of the gospel with more people than his parents, the missionaries, would have ever met. And as if that weren't enough, change church music forever. Only in one of those ironic moments of history, it took an Englishman to set this Irishman's poem aflight. You see, Henry Smart was a musician in the Church of England who was desperately trying to get the church to try something new. We know how it goes. He was trying desperately to get them to change the music just a little bit, to move away from the chants and all of those other hymns, to embrace something like what the Methodists were starting to do. And so he was listening constantly for something out there. And when he heard this poem, and it did mean he had to hear it as he was blind, he immediately heard a tune to go with it. And so he penned Angels from the Realms of Glory in a sitting. And he shared it with the church. And they liked it. And they began to use it in their service, and it was different than almost every liturgical hymn prior to that moment in that it introduced harmony, changing church music forever.
Come and worship, come
Of course, not every tune had years to percolate. Some were born out of necessity, as happened Christmas Eve, 1818, when Joseph Moore was just finishing his first full year as a priest at a little church in Austria. As we ministers do, he had been working for months to try and make sure everything was ready for that special service. The music was picked out, the liturgy was in place, the sermon was ready. He knew what was going to happen, and then, as happened, something went wrong. The organ stopped working. We know the feeling. And he began to panic. He knew he had just a few hours until the service began, and he did not know what he was going to do. He was running around desperately trying to figure out what was going on with the organ. It wasn't the boiler, but it may have been the cold. He knew there was something that he needed to address, but he wasn't going to be able to do it that night. And so he did what we sometimes need to be better at doing. He stopped for a moment to pray. And in that moment, almost miraculously, he remembered a small, simple poem he had written and dismissed a couple of years ago. He remembered it was about a silent night where all was calm and all was bright. Not feeling very calm or particularly bright, he began to desperately search for where he had placed that poem, searching back through his scraps of notes and locating miraculously in his journal that very piece. He tore it out and he folded it up and he placed it into his pocket and he bundled up and headed out into the cold, desperate to find someone to put song with this verse. Which was how he ended up knocking on the door of 31-year-old Franz Gruber, a school teacher who had a gift for music. He explained to him the situation. The organ's not working. The service is getting ready to start. Can you please help me find something that we can teach to the choir and play not using the organ? And the teacher began to think. Within a couple of hours, he was teaching this simple melody to the choir, playing accompaniment on guitar, and changing the way we celebrate Christmas Eve forever. Thank God for silent organs. No. Whereas some carols were born out of necessity, others found birth in pain. When John Wesley Work finished his stint in the Civil War, he began to work as a musician at a small church just outside of Nashville, Tennessee. Having come of age as an African American during the time of slavery, he knew firsthand just how powerful music was to be able to sustain one through even torture. And he desperately wanted to preserve that songbook of slavery, the old spirituals. And so he began to go around and to speak with former slaves and with plantation workers to collect those songs that he was adamant about keeping alive. And he would teach them to his choir, and perhaps more importantly for our story, to the choir at a small African-American college near there, Fisk University. The Fisk Jubilee Singers struck a chord in more ways than one. In a time when very few African Americans left more than a few miles from their home, the Fisk Jubilee Singers, over the course of the next couple of decades, traveled the world, singing for dignitaries and queens and poor alike, introducing the world to those spirituals which had sustained those sorry souls. But it took his son, two of his sons, John Wesley Work II and Frederick Work, to discover a Christmas carol among those pieces. They took up the family business, also looking for the songbook, also trying to collect those songs before they left, and in them they found this Christmas tune which stuck out like a sore thumb, whereas all the other spirituals seemed to lament the existence now and look for that time of hope sometime in the future. This tune was very different. It was jubilant and spoke of the good news of a Savior's birth right now and told that they could do no other than to go out and tell it on the mountains. And so they took the arrangement just as they found it, and they penned it down and shared it with the Fisk Jubilee Singers, who then shared it with the world. But it took yet another generation of the Work family for us to get the carol we know today. You see, John Wesley Work III, now the third generation, took up that family business, went around himself again, going out and speaking with the aging former slaves, and he found a new stanza, a new verse to this song that he took and put it into the arrangement we hear today. A jubilant and joyful reminder that there is a light that no darkness can overwhelm.
Down in the lowly manger, the humble Christ was born, and God sent us salvation, that blessed Christmas morn. Go tell it on the mountain, over the hills and everywhere. Go tell it on the mountain, that Jesus Christ is born.
Of course, some of the hidden figures behind our favorite carols remain hidden. John Jacob Niles knew from a very early age that he loved music. Taught the old spirituals by a beloved farmhand, Niles understood just how meaningful music that spoke of the soul and the experience of pain could be. And he knew that folk music would be a part of his life, even though his career threatened to take him in another direction, at first a very different direction, to a war in France. Born in 1892, he was of prime age when World War I broke out and became a fighter pilot during that conflict. Though he would use the time on the ground to his liking, he would ask almost every soldier he encountered to share with him some piece of their history, some folk song that they could share with him. And so he would take it and he would write it down, he would memorize the tune, and then he would play it for other soldiers. And the whole war experience, he just kept collecting and collecting and collecting those songs. Some he would write on his own, but most he would share that other people had given him, and he would sing those songs. And people loved his voice so much that when he got back home, he had a spot at the Cincinnati Conservatory of Music. They trained him classically and prepared him for a career in opera and set him free to find success and fame, first through Chicago and then New York, even landing him a recording contract with RCA. He was the toast of New York. Only like Miss Clavel in the middle of the night, he knew that something was not right. It seemed to him that the life he was living was not the life that he wanted. Maybe some of us know that feeling. He would be performing on stage for hundreds of adoring fans and only be happy when he came backstage to strum his guitar, playing those folk tunes for the stagehands. And so, when that dichotomy became too great, he left it all behind, moved back home to Kentucky, and dedicated his life to finding and preserving those folk tunes. He would travel throughout Appalachia from town to town, village to village, holler to holler, all desperately searching for that music that he wanted to so preserve before the radio and the automobile allowed them to disappear forever. Which was how, in the December of 1933, he found himself in a small, poor community in North Carolina on a snowy night, watching children in ragged clothes run around the streets. The sight was so different than the streets of New York City that he left that he just paused to take it all in. And in the silence, as the snow fell, he heard a small voice singing out, haunting, beautiful little tune about wondering as she wandered. He had never heard anything quite like it before. It had the pain of a slave spiritual and the irony of an Irish ballad and the truth that only the poor are able to tell. He asked the young girl, "Where did you learn this song?" And she said, "My mother taught it to me, whose mother taught it to her, whose mother had taught it to her," and so on and so forth. And he asked her to sing it for him again, and she graciously did. And he wrote down word for word exactly what she was singing and learned the tune note for note so that he could share it with the world. He spent the next 40 years trying to trace the origin of that tune, but never got further than that little girl, whom he never saw again. Sometimes, like the grace of God, our greatest gifts are a mystery. But make no mistake, friends, we know for whom the bells toll, or who the welkin ring.